Harry Reid was helped found the museum and establish us here in the ERI building, which it was a cooperative venture about 17 years ago when they built this building, in part for the Desert Research Institute and then part for us here in the lower floor for the museum. Very chronologically formatted museum, and it's in general about the history of atomic testing. And the first nuclear test was in July of 1945 in New Mexico, called the Trinity test. Now this is a model, but this is the original Gadget device, plutonium device, that was detonated, I think on July 16th, if I've got my date right. And that was a really, critical time, because Truman then was over in Germany at the talks in Potsdam to oversee, Germany had been defeated, which was kind of ironic because that was the whole reason we built the atomic bomb, to stop the Germans, and we were scared to death Hitler was going to get the bomb. But he was luckily defeated. But by 1945, at that time, we were still fighting Japan. And the Americans and the British knew they still had a big job on their hands defeating the Japanese. So that's what they were concerned with at that time when Truman was over there talking to Stalin and Churchill and putting their heads together. And he had gotten word during that conference that they tested the bomb and it worked, and it elated Truman because he was trying to desperately find a way to bring the war to a conclusion with Japan without sacrificing any more lives. They had told Truman to expect at least 1 million American casualties in the invasion of Japan. So that was twice what the total amount of casualties had been for the whole war, and Truman was not looking forward to that because the American public was getting tired of the war and they wanted to bring it in. So he decided to utilize the atomic bomb to try to speed up the end of war with Japan. Now, what a lot of people don't know is we only had 3 atomic bombs. We had a prototype of a uranium bomb that was very simple, and they knew it would work, and they didn't test that. That was called the Little Boy, and that was the bomb they eventually dropped on Hiroshima. And then they had this bomb, which proved to work. It was a plutonium-based bomb, and that prototype they dropped on Nagasaki. And we're going to see the actual casing that bomb went into in a minute. It's out in the lobby. Then they had 1 bomb in reserve, and the Japanese still had not surrendered, so they were rushing it to the Pacific. But just then the Japanese did surrender, and the war came to an end. And that was kind of that's just the facts and the logic of the matter. And that was the dawn of the nuclear age. And ever since then, the world has kind of revolved around the atomic bomb.
So they actually called it the Gadget. So where did the name come from?
Well, it was literally a science project, and it was pieced together. And you see all these wires and different things. I mean, it was, they were flying by the seat of their pants in a great hurry to try to figure out how to detonate plutonium, which was a man-made product, a byproduct of uranium enrichment or nuclear reactor process. And they literally, in here, they literally had car batteries. The car batteries are what detonated the bomb. There was no specific batteries designed for nuclear weapons, so they took the batteries they had. And if you see these hard points here, you'll see those translated on that casing, and over there when we go to look at it, the shell of the bomb casing was literally made to fit around the bomb instead of the other way around. Usually you make a bomb, you make a casing, and then you put explosives in it. But this was built first, obviously. And this was the bomb that ended up, the type of bomb that ended up being used on Nagasaki. Everyone's aware of the Manhattan Project. That was the effort. And it was really a joint effort with the British. The British, we would have never succeeded in getting the atomic bomb if the British had not already worked 2 or 3 years prior to us coming into the war in their inspiration and their research, made the Manhattan Project possible. And it was a close cooperation with the British and the Americans that made the atomic bomb. And of course, they were involved in the war 2 years before America got involved in the war. And they had some key people that came out of Germany that proved to them that the bomb was practical. You know, for years prior to the war, scientists talked about the atomic bomb. The word atomic bomb was in our vocabulary long before World War II. And a lot of leading scientists understood the theory, but they thought it would take so much enriched material to make a bomb that it would never be practical. The British realized early on in 1939 and into 1940 that you only needed something about the size of an orange in terms of physical amount of enriched material. Now that was no small project in itself, because it took almost 4 to 5 years to make enough enriched uranium for one bomb and plutonium for 2 bombs. But the physics were telling people prior to that it would take an entire room or city block of enriched material to make an atomic bomb. That would have never been possible until they had a key breakthrough and they realized that it was a much smaller amount than people had earlier theorized. Well, when they made the first thermonuclear bombs, they were the size of buildings. And they thought, you know, the early plans for atomic bombs were much bigger than this. But they had to make it fit on an airplane. They actually built an airplane around that, the B-29 project. And this was about the biggest possible thing the B-29 could carry. So it just fit in the bomb bay, and you can see the original bomb casing over there, and we'll go over and talk about that in a minute. They thought it would be something, you know, prior to this, they thought it would be something so big they would have to put on a ship or in a submarine and somehow sneak it into a harbor. They didn't even think it would be practical originally to drop from an airplane. Trinitite is the material that forms, or originally formed in New Mexico when they exploded the first bomb. Basically, the sand melted into a rock type of composite form. But Trinitite forms pretty much anytime you have a nuclear explosion and you have, you know, sand on the ground. So now, that of course was a model, but this is an original bomb casing that was made for the bombing of Japan. Now, for 1945 to 1950, they made about 300 of these casings, because this became the standard model for the atomic bomb, but this is one of the very, very early ones. So it could have easily have been used if the war would have continued with Japan for the bombing of Japan. And of course, these are little blocks they put in there, but they're supposed to simulate what that would look like inside of that, because those were the hard points designed for this shell to go around here. This is an ellipsoid, so no matter how you slice it, you have a circle. But it's kind of a unique design, and they realized early on that when they were going to bomb a city with a nuclear weapon, they didn't want it to explode on the ground. They wanted it to explode up in the air. That would make it cause more damage. So they had to decide how to detonate the bomb 1,000 or 1,500 feet above the ground. There was no technology to do that, so that had to be invented. They had a redundant system where they had a radar trigger that they could trigger the bomb to explode at a certain height. They also had barometric pressure gauges that could trigger the bomb at a pre-designated height. But just in case everything else failed, they had a backup system in the nose with 4 plunger-like devices, and these holes have actually been filled in. But the one thing they did not want to happen is have this bomb captured. So if it didn't detonate in the air, they wanted to make sure it did explode when it hit the ground. And the actual device itself, unlike a modern atomic weapon, was very, very fragile. I mean, it could have easily have gone off by accident. And they didn't know what would happen if a Japanese fighter plane came up and fired machine gun bullets into the bomb, or if there was flak, you know, in an aircraft fire coming up. So they actually had to make this a ballistics casing. And this is over 5,000 pounds of steel here. This is bulletproof.
And they just weren't really sure what they were doing at the time. I mean, they sort of had an idea of how it was going to play out, but it was all so new.
It was all brand new.
Just to rush into war, they just needed to go forward.
Right.
And hope for the best.
Right. And they were learning as they went. I mean, when one of the reasons they tested the bomb was they weren't even sure what the yield would be, how big the explosion would be. And they had guesses that were all over the chart. But they had to be able to gauge it, and they established a metrics or a way to, understand the bomb, but they had to literally blow the bombs up to do it. And as years went by, and that's what the museum is about, it's about atomic testing that followed through the years. The reason they were blowing so many bombs up is because that's the only way they could learn. And Russia had to do it, we had to do it. Today we have advanced computer models, so we don't have to blow bombs up anymore. But some countries do, like North Korea. They don't have those computers, and they're kind of where we were back in the 50s. So that's why they've been continue to test bombs. There are two main periods of nuclear testing. There was the atmospheric period where they blew the bombs up in the air. And then in 1963, there was a treaty signed called the Limited Test Ban Treaty between Russia and America. Those were the only two sides that had bombs at the time. And after that, everything was underground by treaty. North Korea doesn't observe any treaties. They're just blowing bombs up underground because it's easier for them to do. And they have such a small country, they can't blow them up over their own country. And they would get in quite a lot of trouble if they blew them up over somebody else's country. So by necessity, they have to do underground testing. Cut a hole in the runway where the bomb was lowered so the plane could roll over it and they could lower it up into the bomb bay, because it's so big they couldn't even pull it under the aircraft. They had to depress it in the ground. Tibbets personally took controls because he was scared the B-29 was going to crash on takeoff, and a lot of B-29s did. And if that would have happened, this could have gone off. And that was the entire base for the entire bombing of Japan. I mean, they had over 1,000 B-29s on that field. If it would have been an accident, it would have wiped out the entire effort against Japan. So that's a photograph, 4-stage photograph of the first explosion in Trinity. So that's the first atomic explosion. The atomic bombs were not big enough. They were not big enough to have used against Tokyo or Berlin if Germany had still been in the war. So they purposely chose fairly small cities like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and actually Nagasaki was a secondary target. But they had about 6 or 9 sites they chose in Japan. They were vital sites for to the war effort, but they weren't big cities because the first bombs were not that big. Those were the fission weapons, and they were called atomic bombs. And by the 50s, they created a whole different type of nuclear weapon called a fusion device or thermonuclear bomb. And you had to be, over 100 miles or hundreds of miles away when those things went off, because they were thousands of times bigger than this. Most of the museum now is about the atomic testing in the 1950s through 1992, and a lot of that took place at the Nevada test site. This is an aerial photograph of it just north of, about 65 miles north of Las Vegas. Now, after the war, we also did some testing in the South Pacific and the Marshall Islands, and the bigger bombs, the thermonuclear bombs that were developed in the 1950s were all tested out there. But a lot of the testing took place here. And the reason they chose this area was a number of reasons. First of all, after World War II, a lot of the top scientists left Los Alamos and went back to college teaching. And, because nobody thought anybody else could get the bomb for probably a generation. It was so difficult to make the atomic bomb. So we thought we had a monopoly, for at least a lifetime. But to everybody's great surprise, in 1949, Russia tested their first atomic bomb. And it stunned everybody. And it was a big shock because by 1949, the Cold War had started heating up. We had already had the Berlin airlift. That was a big deal in 1948. I mean, that brought us close to World War III. But then, a year later, Russia, lo and behold, demonstrates that they tested the bomb. Now, about a year later, we learned that the reason they got the bomb so fast was they had spies in our own Manhattan Project. But they had competent scientists, and they would have got the bomb regardless. But it really heated things up. So even though there had been a couple tests after World War II by the Americans, they had to go back into high gear in 1949. And the main laboratory was still in Los Alamos in New Mexico. And they had been petitioning for a number of years to have a stateside test site, because going out to the Pacific logistically was a nightmare. It took months to go out there, and you had to put everybody on a ship. And a lot of these people weren't working full time anymore for the Atomic Energy Commission, and it was just very, very difficult. So they wanted some place very close to New Mexico. New Mexico wasn't a good place to explode atomic bombs because it's not quite as remote as you think. It was okay during World War II. But it turned out there was this really, really remote place called the Nevada Bombing and Gunnery Range, which was a huge tract of land the size of Rhode Island, which they set aside back in World War II for the B-24 and B-25 pilots to, and all the bomber pilots to, practice dropping conventional bombs. So it was still on the books, and there was nothing around in those days except a teeny tiny town way down here called Las Vegas, Nevada. Okay, Las Vegas, Nevada was only known because it had legalized gambling. The people on the weekends would come over from California and gamble, but it had about 21,000 people, okay? Very, very small town. It wasn't even considered in the whole spectrum here. What they did in the early days, they flew out from Los Alamos. The scientists flew out and landed in a little airstrip here. And then they would drive out here in Jeeps, because there was no infrastructure at all. And then they would actually fly B-50s, which were souped up B-29s from Albuquerque, and they would drop bombs on this dry lake bed called Yucca Flats. And today, thinking of dropping a nuclear bomb from an airplane on U.S. territory is just unthinkable, but that's what they did. And anyway, the scientists would observe the bombs, and then they would go back and they would fly home. Everybody went home, okay? But then the Cold War heated up even more. We had Korea. We had China fall to the communists, and it was a full-blown emergency. So they had to start testing a lot of atomic bombs, and they had to start getting better scientific diagnostics. And so what they had to do, they had to hire civilian contractors to come out here and build towers and roads and wells and a base camp called Mercury. And all those civilian contractors, most of them had families. And the families needed someplace to live. And the families had kids, and the kids needed schools. So lo and behold, you have thousands of people start to gravitate to this teeny tiny town down here in Las Vegas, Nevada. And over a period of 30, 40 years, 300,000 people moved into Las Vegas. And that's what built up the infrastructure of Las Vegas. It was not the gambling. All these international casinos and hotels, they would have never come here if the infrastructure had not already been built up by this massive nuclear testing project. Nuclear testing was the economic driver for Nevada for over 40 years. Now, those craters are actually from the later period of underground testing. When they dropped bombs from the air, or when they put bombs on towers, they didn't leave craters. In fact, the whole goal of an atomic blast was to get it up as high as you could so that the blast does not touch the ground, because that's when it gets very dirty and you have fallout. So the early period, the atmospheric period, 1945 to 1963, left no craters. 1963, limited test ban treaty, they went underground, and what they ended up doing was digging deep holes where they put their atomic bombs. And when you blow a bomb up underground, it leaves a cavity. And then the very top of the soil subsides, which is exactly what they wanted. They wanted that hole filled in. So those are all subsidence craters of the underground test. And they did almost 1,000 underground tests and 100 above ground tests. They had a lot of civil defense tests where they built houses of different materials, brick, wood, and they built all sorts of things out there. They took bridges out there. They had bank safes. They blew all sorts of stuff up to see what nuclear war would do. One more thing I'll say here, you see these yellow lines, those are grid lines. They were just put on there to help, reference off different areas, and they literally name the areas by a number, area 6, area 30, or a random number. There used to be another part of the test site up here called Area 51, and it was part of nuclear testing, and then in the mid-50s, there was a big dry lake bed up there, and Kelly Johnson started going out there and flying his early reconnaissance aircraft, because it was very secret. So the U-2 and SR-71 was developed out there, and then eventually became a Air Force Base, and today it's a big Air Force Base.
But at the time, they didn't advertise Area 51. It was like top
It
secret.
went off the books in the 60s, but if you look at the early phone books and things of the test site, it's listed. And all through the years, the same contractors, and this was all run by civilian contractors, the same contractors worked here that worked there. A lot of our docents on a typical day are former Area 51 personnel. And today, a lot of people commute back and forth on an airplane to Area 51 every day from Las Vegas. There's a lot of civilians that work out there. And Mercury was a little base camp at the base of the test site that had all the support areas. And, they had a bowling alley and everything you can imagine. People have a misconception that it was a town. It wasn't a town. They gave it a name because they wanted a post office there. And the only way you could get a post office address was to get a zip code with a name. And they chose Mercury because in the early days there were all these broken bottles all over the desert floor. What they were old mercury bottles that the early pioneer prospectors had. And mercury is a substance you use to test for gold and silver. And so that's how it came up with the name Mercury. And Mercury is still there. It's still a base camp for the operations that take place on the Nevada test site. The letter that Einstein wrote to Roosevelt to urge him to do atomic research. This is one of the most popular things we have. It's kind of pop culture from the 50s. And I tell people, today you talk about atomic weapons and people kind of frown. But back in the 50s, it was a popular thing. And Americans, the post-World War II culture, they were very, very proud that they had the bomb and they were blowing it up. And especially the people here in Nevada. The high school put nuclear mushroom cloud on the cover of their yearbook. It was the in thing, and everybody was into it. That differs dramatically to that second period of atomic testing, which was underground. And then things became very, very different. You're going to see that on the film. But in the early days, this was the in thing. And we often compare it to North Korea, because we did a lot of programs in the past couple of years in North Korea. And everybody's telling North Korea, you got to get rid of your bombs. You can't have nuclear bombs. Well, just imagine in the 1950s if Canada or Mexico told us that we had to get rid of our bombs. We would have just laughed at them, because it became part of our national identity. Americans were proud of the fact they had atomic bombs. And that's exactly what North Korea is like today. They're never going to give up their bomb because it's their national identity. They're very, very proud of it. Now, some of those things are actually go back to the 1930s because the name atomic weapon first entered the popular culture in the Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon serials of the 1930s. And those were big things. Kids loved those. Those were like the Star Wars of today. And the vocabulary of atomic bombs, they had atomic hand grenades, that all came out of that, although it was also originally put in culture in 1914 by H.G. Wells, who actually coined the word to atomic weapon. So it goes back as far as 1914. In 1922 or 23, Winston Churchill wrote an article. He wrote a lot of articles. And he theorized about a nuclear weapon the size of an orange that would destroy a city. And the plutonium pit that destroyed Nagasaki was exactly the size of an orange. Now this area here is more devoted to the Marshall Islands, or at least this part of it, where we did a lot of atomic testing. They were all atmospheric shots. And the later ones were the thermonuclear shots. From 1952 to 1963, we blew a lot of bombs up out there, and a lot of really, really big bombs. These things were so large they were measured in not kilotons but megatons. And our biggest one was 15 megatons, and there's a photograph of it. That's the biggest bomb we ever blew up. And of course they were still learning, and it went off at 15 megatons. And it killed the Japanese fishermen. It really radiated a lot of Pacific Islanders because they didn't know it would be that big. And it was very controversial. It was called the Castle Bravo shot, and it made national headlines. You know, today we think back of nuclear testing and we think of the downwinders. That was mainly Nevada, Arizona, where the winds went. But that didn't become recognized until many years later. This was apparent right at the time, and this is what people started to get worried about. And this is what eventually led to moving the test underground, because it really was very messy. And then Russia exploded a bomb of 50 megatons. It was supposed to be 100 megatons, but it was reduced down to 50, and that blew a hole in the upper atmosphere and scared everybody. And then we had the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which really scared everybody. And that's what really led to the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963. In those early days, I mean, you could be in old downtown Las Vegas and you could see the mushroom clouds from the rooftops of the casinos. And there would be parties at night, because that's usually when the bombs were exploded, just before dawn, because they wanted a background to the photograph, and that was part of the diagnostics. You'll like this film. It kind of sums everything up in 10 minutes. The first minute of this is kind of unique, though. It tries to make you kind of feel what it was like to go out to the test site and actually see one of these original bombs go off in the air. And believe it or not, there was actually a VIP viewing area for the early atomic test. But you weren't in a concrete bunker like this. You were literally out on the desert floor on bleachers. And, you know, a lot of, you know, Walter Cronkite was often invited out there, Edward R. Murrow, senators, congressmen. They actually took 2 school field trips out there to watch some of these detonations. And you were seated about 9 miles away from the tower where the bomb was. And the only protection or warning they gave you was not to look at the blast, because the flash was so bright it could damage your eyes. It would be like looking at the sun. So they would usually give you dark goggles. And these weren't like sunglasses, these were like welder's glasses. But you would feel, you know, the wind come at you and the sand, and then you'd feel the same wind hit your back, because when a nuclear explosion goes off, it creates a vacuum, and it pushes out, then it sucks it back in. Harry Truman intentionally removed the military from anything to do with nuclear weapons, because he didn't want the same thing that happened in World War II, where the military was actually in charge of the nuclear bombing in Japan. So he established the Atomic Energy Commission, and today it's evolved into the Department of Energy. But ever since Harry Truman, civilians have been in charge of nuclear testing, and civilians are in charge of the storage of nuclear weapons. And the Air Force or the Army can't use them without the President of the United States authorizing it. So that's always been deemed a very, very good thing. But you see a lot of military people in this, because they were training troops in those early days to be around atomic blasts, because they wanted them to be psychologically acclimated to seeing a lot of nuclear explosions. And that's was one of the worst things that happened, was because, you know, the VIPs, you were 9 miles away, but those troops were only a mile away from an explosion in trenches, and you're going to see the trenches. And they didn't get hurt with the explosion, but years later, they had a lot of health effects. But that was going to be the concept of a European war. If the Russians charged into Europe through the Fulda Gap, Eisenhower was going to use very small nuclear weapons to stop the Russians, because he didn't want to get in an arms race, you know.
Put on your gun. Observers without goggles must face away from the left. H minus 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, shockwave will arrive shortly. Keep on putting until wave passes.
There was never a detonation that you weren't scared. You get to the countdown, and when it goes 10, 9, 8, every thought you can think of goes through your head.
You stand looking out into the distance with goggles on, and all of a sudden the sky lights up, everything lights up. And once the light dims a little bit, you can take your goggles off and you see the shock wave coming across the desert.
So you watch this wall of dust, very thin dust, racing across the desert at you, and of course when it gets to you, that's when you hear the first noise from the explosion.
To see it here, you recognize that it's a very, very terrible weapon of war. And when you see one, you understand what it can do and why it must never be used, but you understand the value of having it and having your enemies know that you're not afraid to use it if you want.
After World War II, we only had a few bombs. We knew that they would explode, but we didn't really know the consequences. So the first type of testing was done in the South Pacific. Then in the 1950s, some things happened that made that setting not so appropriate. The Soviet Union got their own atomic weapon. We began to fight in Korea. We began to look for a place that was closer to home, would be cheaper, would be more secure. And that's when they found the Nevada test site.
When I saw those films and things, I used to think they were very sophisticated test dummies, okay? And then I heard the story. It was back from the days of the civil defense test where they were literally, building houses. They were called doom towns, houses and different structures because they wanted to see what a nuclear war would do to things. And they actually learned a lot from that, how to reinforce houses and so forth. But there was all this new clothing coming out at the time, rayon and nylon and all these things. So they wanted to test that. They wanted to see what the heat of a nuclear weapon would do to the new clothing. So they went down to the local J.C. Penney and they borrowed some mannequins. And, most of the mannequins, they were placed at different, distances from the bombs and things. And most of the mannequins survived the blast. And, there was no big budget for this at the time, so they just dusted them off and they took them back. And these are actually 3 of the original mannequins that were later brought to the museum. We look back in history as we had a big civil defense movement, but it was never very big. There was a lot of government literature, there was a lot of films and things. There was Geiger counters and some stored food and things the government distributed to certain areas of the country for fallout shelters. But there was never really any serious investment in civil defense. There were plans put in place, but the whole thing kind of lost momentum into the 70s and the 80s simply because the bombs got so big and the nuclear arsenals became so large that it just got to the point. I mean, Reagan was the last president to come up with a civil defense proposal, and the best they could come up with by 1980 was just to basically have the people go into the countryside because there was no way to survive, the thermonuclear weapons by that time. Russia and China have never given up their civil defense. They always had a highly well-funded civil defense, and it's still active to this day. But we never had that. We think we had it, but we never really did. About 10% of private Americans did build bomb shelters or reinforced an area in their basement. When I was a kid, my father was the air raid shelter for the small community we lived in. He worked in a bank, and the basement of the bank was a fallout shelter for the community. And I used to love to go down there with him because there were cots and there was, you know, a yellow Geiger counter and there were these drums of, you know, I don't know what they were, powdered eggs or something, you know. And even as like 10 years old, I would say to my dad, I said, well, if a nuclear war came, you know, there's like places for 15 people here, but, you know, we had about 5,000 people in our community. And I would say to him, I said, how would that work? And he says, I have no idea. You know, he was part of the administration, but he was never given any directives or specific information. Looking back, it looks like a really well-organized thing, but it wasn't. News Knob was one of the key places where they had the bleachers up on a bluff, where they had these demonstrations like you saw in the film. And that's one of the original signs from it. As I said, a lot of the famous early commentators, Walter Cronkite probably covered more of the blast than anybody else. By 1963, nuclear testing moved underground. This is actually part of a tunnel where they blew up a nuclear bomb. There were two types of underground testing. You tunneled into a hillside, which was the easiest way to do it. And that's why India, Pakistan, North Korea, that's how they test. They just dig a tunnel with a fish hook on the end because it's the cheapest, most effective way to do it. Now we did that, but ours was a lot more sophisticated. We actually had things like that, like iron or steel encased tunnels, and they were more for specific scientific experiments where they could carefully gauge the diagnostics. One thing that came out of the above ground test in the 1950s when they started exploding bombs up in the upper atmosphere and actually into space was they learned there was a phenomenon called an electromagnetic pulse. And that's when you take a very, very large nuclear weapon and you blow it up in lower or upper space. And at the time, our electronics were very, very primitive. We still had large, you know, tubes and things. But they were starting to affect those things. And they're very worried about that because they wanted to know what that would do. But that was at the end of above ground testing. So when they went into underground testing in 1963, they still wanted to figure out a way to experiment to learn more about electromagnetic effects. And they learned a lot. And today that has helped us because today our electronics are so fragile that certainly a nuclear war would disturb them, but also a solar flare. And this will probably happen in our lifetime. I mean, we could face a terrible Armageddon from a very intense solar flare or CME, coronal mass ejection, which would really play havoc with our sensitive electronics. But they learned enough from this underground testing that at least the military is very hardened now. Their systems are very hardened, and we know how to harden our electronics. It's just very expensive, and we don't want to do it. But we know how to do it because of this testing. But most of the underground testing in America, and then later Russia, was deep holes in the ground, vertical shafts, 1,000, 1,500 feet down. And, you know, that all had to be created on the spot because in 1963, oil well may be 12 inches wide, an oil bill. But to lower a nuclear bomb in the ground, you need a hole 30, 40, 50, 60 inches wide. Nothing existed to dig a hole that big. That all had to be created at the test site, and that's what they did. And as I explained earlier, the craters out there, most of the craters are from the underground test, not the above ground test, because an underground explosion leaves a cavity and then the whole thing collapses down, which is what they want to seal it, and you have these subsidence or depression craters. Now there is an exception to that. There was another project out there called Plowshare, where they experimented with using nuclear weapons for civil engineering. We were going to, you know, maybe build canals or harbors with nuclear weapons. And at the very end of the film we just saw, you saw that huge sand crater. That's actually considered part of the atmospheric period, where they would blow bombs up right under the surface to see how much Earth they could physically move. Russia, however, actually did use nuclear weapons for civil engineering, but they have a lot higher tolerance in the sense that, I say tolerance, not a physical tolerance, but they're more disposed to to radiation and not being as worried about it in their history. The Sedan crater, which you can actually tour when the tours start up again, you can actually go to the rim of that and stand there. And it's perfectly safe, but there is background radiation. So even though it's safe to visit, you wouldn't want to build your house there. The Russians never worried about that, but there was a period where they would use nuclear weapons for civil engineering, as our Plowshare project had envisioned, but we never did that because we just didn't have the tolerance. I want to tell you about this, and then there's a 3-minute film I want you to see. But when they dug those deep holes, this is what they would lower the nuclear device in. It would be at the bottom. It'd be all these shells. These things were called canisters or racks, depending which national lab. And it was the national labs that did the testing, okay? They would come to the test site. This stuff wasn't built and designed at the test site. This stuff was engineered in Los Alamos and Lawrence Livermore. And then the scientists would come to the test site with their equipment, and they would conduct a test. And there would be all sorts of instrumentation, and then these cables would hook to here. You're going to see this film in a minute. You're going to see hundreds of cables going and then down in the ground. And they actually could get a lot better diagnostic data from underground testing. And they learned a lot of science. And they learned a lot of technology. I mean, coaxial cables, the cell phone, all those technologies led to things we have today that was involved in testing.
I've seen a lot of atmospheric tests, and I've been in a lot of underground tests, and there isn't any way to compare them. When we did underground shots, we shielded from ourselves and from the public what nuclear explosions are really like. I actually get frightened over the fact that eventually there will be no one alive who's ever seen one of these things. We don't want to lose that sense of awe about nuclear weapons.
When the limited test ban treaty went into effect that restricted testing to the underground environment, there was a lot of skepticism about whether you could look at the device in the same way being deeply buried underground. And people found, to their, I think, surprise, that the data was much better underground.
The experimenters did not want to go underground. They wanted to do what they'd always been doing, but the reason we went underground was to stop the fallout.
There are two main types of weapons tests. One is for the development of the weapon itself in vertical shafts, and the other one is to measure the effects of nuclear weapons on military hardware, and these are usually done in tunnels.
In general, the horizontal tests in the tunnels were driven by effects of a nuclear device on military equipment.
Immediately after the bomb goes off, there would be closures to close the pipes quickly enough so that you could go in and recover the military hardware afterwards.
In the tunnel, you could go back and retrieve that equipment. So that was the principal driver for the horizontal tests. On the other hand, the vertical tests were looking more at how the device itself performed. And for that, you needed a lot of diagnostics, and they were located in a rack or canister above the bomb. Typically, you might do 10 or more tests of devices to settle on the design of one bomb. It was an orchestrated effort. And people always, in the test program, had three things going. They had a test that they were analyzing data on. They had a test they were preparing for. And they had a test that they were designing. There was this running production line of events out at the test site. And in fact, the Yucca Flat area was bristling with cranes.
Thousands of people have been working for months, and it all comes to that last second. At zero time, everything is immediately short-circuited because everything is being vaporized at the bottom of the hole.
This generates a horse race that's going on underground. The race is getting all of the data before all of the detector and the wiring and all of it is vaporized. for physicists. They were on pins and needles to find out if they collected data.
There were some shots in which my heart was pounding uncontrollably by the time we got to zeros. If it failed, I would know it in just an eye blink.
Testing nuclear devices can be dangerous. So one of the concerns is to make sure that we contain all the radioactivity that can result from this explosion.
In the early 70s, test codenamed Bainberry had a massive containment failure. The radioactive gases from that explosion came out through crack. So there was a big cloud that in fact looked a little like a mushroom cloud.
We discovered that there were a whole number of things that we didn't know about it. But every one of these venting experiences, we said we'll never have that thing again. And that's happened. We never saw those things again. It's a race against Mother Nature because she's trying to outwit you all the time. And so you have to outthink her.
And in 1992, Russia, America stopped nuclear testing. They paused it, and then different treaties came up. We never actually officially signed anything, but we have, since 1992, chosen not to resume nuclear testing. This film is great, but it's a little bit outdated because technically, you know, computers have gotten so advanced now with AI and modeling that they can do everything they want to do pretty much with computer modeling. As I mentioned to you earlier, a country like North Korea doesn't have that power. So they literally have to test nuclear weapons to learn what they're doing with a nuclear test. Two things that people don't realize is, number one, why we did so many tests and what happened after 1992. Now, we did a lot of different tests because we were, in the early days, because we were blowing the bombs up to learn, initially, how to make the bombs smaller in size, but bigger in yield, or bigger in explosive power. The reason for that was there was another big invention that came out of World War II called the rocket. And a lot of people wanted to take a rocket and go to the moon. Other people wanted to take a rocket and put a nuclear weapon on it. But our early nuclear weapons, just like North Korea's early nuclear weapons, were too big and heavy to put on the top of a rocket. So it took about 10 years to make the bombs smaller in size and weight and bigger in explosive power. At the same time, there was a 10-year project that went on mainly over in White Sands, New Mexico, of developing an intercontinental ballistic missile. Both America and Russia attained those two goals about the same time, about a year or so before the Cuban Missile Crisis, which made that crisis so dangerous. North Korea reached that point about 3 years ago in their evolution. And at that same time, North Korea crossed the thermonuclear threshold, just like we crossed the thermonuclear threshold in early 1950s, about the same time Russia did. So that was the original reason for nuclear testing. And then, you know, after that, there were all sorts of different reasons. They were experimenting with EMPs. We put a lot of time in making our nuclear weapons safer. Now that sounds kind of stupid, but people envisioned that someday an Air Force plane would be carrying a nuclear weapon and it would have a system failure, it would crash accidentally. And that was very far-sighted because that happened actually quite a few times. And we've never had a nuclear weapon go off by accident. That's because we put so much energy into making the systems very safe. You know, you can take an American nuclear weapon and put a stick of dynamite under it, and it won't make it go off. You can shoot a rifle bullet into it. It took a lot of testing to make it that safe. Other countries never worried about that like we did. And even though we've had a lot of nuclear accidents, we've never had one go off. And then the other thing, 1992, what people don't realize is, yes, Russia and America, for a period, reduced their nuclear forces and tensions de-escalated. We actually went so far as to dismantle our nuclear weapons production. We have not built a new nuclear weapon since the 1980s. Everything we have today is now getting old. And accordingly, what we have to do, what the national labs have to do, is every year evaluate our nuclear stockpile and send a letter to the President of the United States assuring that our nuclear weapons are safe, secure, and reliable. That's called Stockpile Stewardship, and a lot of that still takes place at the Nevada National Security Site. That's the new name for the old test site. So a lot of work still goes on out there. This year, we're going to start building some new exhibits. From that point on, the last two rooms there are really kind of outdated, and we're going to put a lot more exhibits in that bring it up to speed. Because what's happening now, you know, you just watch the news, and Russia and China are getting very aggressive. And what they've done in the past few years is they have started to build new nuclear weapons. We have not done that for almost 40 years, but now China and Russia are. And they are now entering fourth generation nuclear weapons. We don't even know what their capability is, but they're far outstripping our capability. Nuclear rocket display, I didn't even talk about that, but that was another project on the test site. Kennedy wanted us to go to Mars after the moon. So they developed this nuclear-powered rocket. That's the actual engine bell for it, and it worked. It's still on the shelf of NASA, and it may be used if we ever take men to Mars, because we have to get them there pretty fast, because there's a lot of radiation in space. But that was closed down in '68 simply because the project was complete. And just before his assassination, Kennedy came out here to view the nuclear rocket project. Nuclear weapons emergency things were formed at the test site, and they're still monitored. They're still run by MSTS, which is the new contractor that runs the test site. You ever see the Super Bowl or inaugural election? You see these helicopters in the air. Those are people who work for the National Nuclear Security Organization that are in charge of monitoring for dirty bombs or nuclear terrorism. NEST was formed out of the test site. It's no longer called NEST. The first nuclear accident was handled by the test site when a Russian satellite crashed in Canada with a plutonium battery on it. And, you know, there was nobody else to call on. I mean, there was one group of people exploding nuclear weapons in the desert. The president called on these guys, and they all went up to Alaska. You know, but that's all. But after that, they said, hey, we got to get organized. We got to get a team together, an emergency response team. All sorts of history of Geiger counters, dosimeters. Those were people who worked at the test site wore dosimeters to monitor their exposure to radiation, and they were very carefully monitored. And nobody has ever gotten sick. Okay. The people who get sick are the people who were like the soldiers who were put at ground zero, or maybe people in Arizona, Utah, where some of the radiation fell out, and certainly a lot of the Pacific Islanders. But this is a really good map because it shows Las Vegas, Boulder City. Boulder City used to be a lot bigger than Las Vegas. And during World War II, this is what was set aside for the Las Vegas bombing and gunnery range. And you can still go out there and find old World War II ordnance and stuff. And then 1951, they carved this section out for nuclear testing. Big dry lake bed up here, Groom Lake, that became Area 51. But this is known today as a Tonopah Test Site, and all sorts of things were developed, tested out there. The B-2, the stealth fighter, that little airstrip that they used to fly into today is an Air Force facility called Creech, and that's where they control all the drones that fly around the world. Over 1,000 people work out there every day, and at least 1,000 or 1,500 work out at the test site every day, and they all commute. This is another bomb. This is a thermonuclear bomb. This was our biggest one, 9 megatons. Russia's main bomb was a 20 megaton. You ever see Dr. Strangelove? This is the bomb. And piece of the Berlin Wall, and that's really what ended the fall of the Soviet Union, really is what kept nuclear testing off the table for a long period of time. That used to be our last artifact, and then after 9/11 we had the New York Fire Department come out here to Las Vegas because they were one of the first groups that were given training on using Geiger counters, and that takes place at the test site. That's another thing they do out there today. And they toured the museum and they loved it. And I wasn't here at the time, but the tour guide was saying, okay, this is the end of the timeline, the Berlin Wall. And he says, hey, that's not the end of the timeline. We're going to give you something for the end of your timeline. So they got a piece of steel from one of the World Trade Center towers and they put it here, and it's been very popular. And it's so important, I think, because kids don't get that in school. There's no reason for them to study it. And it was probably a year ago, we had a young teacher, I don't know, she's probably 20-something, and she brought her students in here, and I was giving the tour, and I was finishing up the tour, and I says, now this is the end of our timeline, 9/11. And the teacher looks at me and she says, 9/11, no, I've heard of that. Just remind me what 9/11 was. That thing is important, so we don't forget it. I've been here about 7 years, and I'm kind of the administrator. So I don't, usually, a lot of other people do the tours and stuff, but I'm the administration. I've run museums for almost 40 years. We do an e-blast every month, and I'll put your email on there so you'll get that. It's free. And a lot of those go into the web page.
And you give talks?
We do talks. We got like handouts. We got all sorts of stuff.
Distinguished lecture series?
Yes. Usually about once a month we bring in a prominent individual. Now COVID really turned that upside down, so a lot of it's been virtual right now. But we'll get back to more in-person stuff. Although we're actually reaching more people virtually than we ever did before because our building's so small. So we'll definitely continue the virtual online presentations of those lectures.
And you're an affiliate of the Smithsonian, so what
Yes.
benefits does that bring to your museum?
We meet certain criteria to be an affiliate. We don't get any funding from them, but it's kind of a badge of honor. It's a very prestigious thing, and kind of shows the high quality of our subject matter. Before COVID, 90% of our visitors were international. It's why it's hurt us so much, because we should have 300 people today. We were doing almost 100,000 people a year before COVID. We get a lot of field trips. We get there's a lot of government people who come here for tours that are in different phases of training, and a lot of people who come from Washington or around the country. Government people who visit the test site will come here for tours because this gives you a good background before you go out there. To this day, the board, the Nevada Test Site Historical Foundation that runs the museum, they're basically the top people from the days of nuclear testing. We have the president of EG&G, big contractor. We have the last president of RICO, who did all the drilling. We have Troy Wade, just passed away a day ago. He was on the film. He was the top guy out there for many years. All the elite top people formed this museum.
So you mainly rely on donations?
Yes, and admissions. Yeah, and you'll see our museum store, and that helps out too.